sort of dramatise it, but compared to sort of a withering on the vine, how long can these links continue if they're not well maintained, well serviced? I mean, how much lifeblood do they have this time in a year?
Yeah, well, look, what happened is, fortunately, at the very beginning, the government moved quickly and did put in place an international air freight capacity scheme. And what that's done is allowed the government to top up our passenger flights and some cargo flights into New Zealand to keep them there and basically help to cover the operating costs, which you can't do when you're only carrying 30 passengers, of course. That's managed to hang on, and that's why we've still got these 12 links going through to other countries. So it's going to be a period of the government extends that through to 2021. Without that, I think we would lose the vast majority of the remaining links by mid this year, because the airlines just simply aren't in a position to lose money.
All right. Barnes Executive Director Justin T. Gumbers, thank you very much for your time. Meanwhile, used to having our own company, Amy Aotearoa, how does that sit with you? I mean, how is your, you've travelled a bit, how has your mind shifted when it comes to travelling?
Strange, isn't it? It's just a sort of a sense of the new normal, and I think it's not knowing how long it runs for. I think it's fantastic seeing New Zealanders getting out there and exploring New Zealand. That, I mean, the number of Aucklanders have discovered that we've got a South Island has been something to behold. Actually, they can actually start to stuff off again now. But I mean, that's a beautiful thing. But it's just that sense of thinking, when will it ever go back to normal? Will it go back to normal? What does that look like? You know, how is travel going to be over the next 5-10 years? It's a bit surreal, but we're adapting.
All right. Hey, you both have been fantastic on the panel. I really appreciate it. Sam Johnson, Amy Adams, have a great weekend.
Thanks, Wallace.
And thank you. And thank you to Emma Hurley for producing the show this week. Appreciate it. I'm Wallace Chapman. I'm back 3:45 Monday. Bye.
Whakarongo mai koe ki te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. Haere nei, no training for the Pakistan cricket team until the players are out of managed isolation. It's too risky, reckons the DG of Health. Auckland Ports has been fined $500,000 for a preventable accident that killed a young father. And there's claims that a freight backlog on those wharves is turning into a safety issue, with hundreds of containers from diverted ships now having to be trucked around the country. Auckland's expecting a long hot summer. Does it have the water to go the distance? The pug versus the whale, a warning for pet owners ahead of Christmas, and a special documentary investigating the struggles of whanau caring for severely disabled children.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora, ko Susana Leata with DNA. The police believe an Auckland businesswoman was killed in her home before she was found dead in a car boot in Sunny Hills last weekend. Investigators have formally identified 55-year-old Elizabeth Zhong as the victim and say they're continuing a scene examination at her home. Acting Detective Inspector Sean Vickers says Ms Zhong was last seen there last Friday afternoon. Her car was found on Saturday morning at 10 o'clock.
Police located Elizabeth's Land Rover vehicle on Roadley Avenue on Saturday the 28th of November. Now, we know from the scene examination that Elizabeth was killed in her house. So we are satisfied that Elizabeth was placed into that vehicle when she was deceased and that items from within the house were placed over her to conceal her.
Acting Detective Inspector Sean Vickers. The country's local government association hopes the call to replace Tauranga's council with commissioners will get the governance of the rapidly growing city back on track. Local Government New Zealand backs Minister of Local Government Nanaia Mahuta's moves to appoint commissioners amid dysfunction and infighting at the council. Its president, Stuart Crosby, is a former mayor of Tauranga and supports the decision. He says it's a tough job, but no excuse for some of the behaviour by councillors. Microbiologist Susie Wiles says it's a good call to keep the Pakistan men's cricket team from training while they remain in isolation. The Director General of Health, Dr Ashley Bloomfield, has denied an exemption for the team, so they can't train until they complete managed isolation in their Christchurch hotel. He says he has ongoing concerns about the risk of cross-infection. There have been 6 acute cases of COVID-19 within the 53-member squad. Dr Susie Wiles says some of the team who have tested negative may still be incubating the virus.
I think it's an abundance of caution to make sure that there's no contact between people in case anyone is infectious, and that would allow it to transmit. So I'm sure the team are disappointed, but I think that's the right call to make.
Dr Susie Wiles. The Digital Economy Minister David Clark will seek advice on the safeguards surrounding facial recognition technology following a critical report. A major study out today has called for more controls around the use of such software, arguing that New Zealand's state surveillance systems are too powerful. It also suggests a biometrics commissioner be appointed. Dr Clark says he will ask his officials to look into whether more regulations or oversight are needed when it comes to facial recognition. He says such technology can only be used in accordance with the Bill of Rights and Privacy Act. Central Otago fruit growers are urging people to continue applying for jobs despite union concerns people are waiting weeks for responses. The industry has come under increasing scrutiny after calling for workers to help with harvest, only to turn people away or take weeks to respond to applications, if at all. Cheeky cherry owner Martin Milne says Central Otago growers will need all hands on deck this season without the usual influx of overseas workers.
I think there is a lot of work around here. I think it's just coming up to the end of December and beginning of January. That's when things are really going to crank up. I would expect people to be getting employed by then. There's a lot of fruit on the trees and it has to come off. So if you don't get the job first time out, don't get disheartened. Keep your finger on the pulse and keep applying.
Central Otago fruit grower Martin Milne. A $13.5 million piece of tunnelling equipment has been blessed and formally named Dame Whina Cooper in Auckland today. The 910-tonne boring machine will be used to dig 2 1.6-kilometre rail tunnels from Mount Eden to the city centre from April next year as part of the City Rail Link project. The name, which was decided in an online vote, refers to the Māori land rights champion who led a protest hikoi from the far north to Parliament in 1975. Her daughter, Hinerangi Cooper, says it's a brave choice and City Rail Link workers can feel reassured in Dame Whina's company. It's 4 minutes past 5. The Black Caps have declared on 519 for 7 on day 2 of the first cricket test against the West Indies in Hamilton. Black Caps captain Kane Williamson has achieved his highest test match score, spending more than 10 hours at the crease as he scored his 3rd double century in test cricket before being dismissed just after tea for 251. A short time ago, the West Indies were 3 without loss. The New Zealand Warriors have committed to spending 3 months in Australia to start their 2021 National Rugby League season. In early January, the club will return to Tamworth in New South Wales, where they spent some of last season before settling on the Central Coast for the opening 4 rounds of the competition. The club is planning on being back in New Zealand for a home game against Manly on April 9th. Warriors CEO Cameron George says attempts to unite the squad in Auckland for a pre-season were shut down by the New Zealand government.
What we tried to achieve after Christmas was to bring all the Australian-based players and staff that are over there at the moment into New Zealand through a quarantine facility very similar to what the Wallabies undertook when they came over. However, that was declined, so we have no other alternative but to head offshore.
Cameron George, the Warriors Chief Executive. That's the news.
Tomorrow morning, winner of this year's Booker Prize, Douglas Stewart. Lloyd Spencer Davis on the suppression of the dreadful truth about the depravity of penguins. Judith Jones on describing visual arts for those who cannot see. And Australian journalist Laura Tingle on bridging the ditch. I'm Kim Hill. Join me tomorrow morning from 8 on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland cloudy periods, rain around midday tomorrow. Auckland, Coromandel Peninsula and Bay of Plenty. Cloudy periods but fine in Bay of Plenty today. A few showers from tomorrow afternoon. Waikato to Kapiti Coast, including central high country. Fine spells, isolated light showers, rain from tomorrow afternoon. Gisborne, Hawke's Bay, Wellington, Nelson and Marlborough. Fine today, scattered rain tomorrow from late morning to evening south of Mahia. Bulla, Westland and Fiordland, periods of rain, some heavy falls and thunderstorms with hail tomorrow. Canterbury, Otago and Southland, fine tonight, apart from a few showers in Southland and Otago clearing. Rain for a time tomorrow morning, then showers, possibly thundery towards the coast. Showers clearing inland by the evening. And Chatham Islands, cloudy periods with a few showers from tonight. RNZ National, it's 7 minutes past 5.
Thanks, Susanna. Kia ora and welcome to Checkpoint. Laboom Dyer was 23 years old, a father working at Auckland ports as a straddle crane driver. He was on the night shift in August 2018 when he was critically injured after the loader he was operating fell over. He died in hospital. Today, the port was fined $500,000 for its role in this young dad's death and what the court has described as an entirely preventable tragedy. Our reporter, Nita Blake-Person, has been covering the case and she joins me now in the studio. Nita, can we start? What actually happened on the night that Laboom Dyer had this accident?
Well, Mr Dyer was working the 12-hour night shift, which starts at 7 p.m. and takes you right through till 7 a.m. The 26th, 27th of August, back in 2018. He drove a machine called a straddle. These are these huge 8-wheeled vehicles. They're about 13 metres above the ground and they move the shipping containers around the port. They take instructions from someone else around where those containers need to be assigned, and at around 3:45 he was given instructions to move one container to one particular place, but he'd already moved past the turning point for where he needed to be. So he attempted a U-turn in one of these big machines while travelling at 25 kilometres an hour. Now that's the fastest maximum speed allowed, and the straddle tipped over with Mr Dyer inside it. So he sustained really serious injuries and was taken to Auckland Hospital but later died. And as a side note, his donated organs helped save the lives of 6 people.
So WorkSafe has obviously looked into this. What went wrong here and who is responsible?
Well, there were multiple failings by the ports of Auckland here to keep their staff safe. Laboom Dyer hadn't been wearing a seatbelt at the time, and CCTV footage later revealed he'd been using his mobile phone in the lead up to the accident. Those were both breaches of the port's own safety rules, which WorkSafe found there was frequent disregard for by staff. But many failings by the ports themselves. Judge Evangelos Thomas described those as systemic failings around the port safety protocols with this machinery, particularly a bonus scheme which rewarded drivers for working quickly and moving the containers despite safety breaches, insufficient training given to staff for the machinery being operated, and he said that was an entirely predictable outcome here.
So, to be clear, they were getting paid more if they went faster?
That's right, and here's what Judge Evangelos Thomas had to say about that.
Operating a bonus system based on productivity, which would cause drivers to feel that they had to work as fast as possible. Mr Dyer had a high tip alarm activation record. Despite that record, he consistently received his bonuses. Ports of Auckland has pleaded guilty to a charge of failing to ensure the health and safety of workers and thereby exposing Mr Dyer to the risk of death.
So there was mention in there of a tip rate, and that's basically the number of instances drivers risked toppling their machines. It would alert someone. Now, Mr Dyer had one of the highest tip rates in the company, but he continued to consistently receive that bonus, basically reinforcing his risky behaviour.
So what was the family's reaction today?
Well, there were whanau and friends gathered in court. They've had to wait more than 2 years for this day, and the judge acknowledged their heartache and loss in all of this. The victim impact statements weren't shared with the court, but the judge did say that they were dignified and there was a palpable sense of loss from all those people. Mr Dyer has a young son who will grow up without his father, and it was clearly a really sad day for everyone today.
And the sentence?
$540,000 was the fine for the breach of the Health and Safety Act, and then reparations, that was $136,000 to Mr Dyer's family, including $80,000 to go to his son.
OK, well, one of the critical questions here is, have the ports of Auckland sorted this all out?
Changes have been made, we can say that much. The bonus scheme must now have, to get that payment, drivers must now have 0 tip alarms for the month to get their bonus, and the Port has taken steps to improve safety. They've taken full responsibility for this accident, but of course this all comes far too late for Mr Dyer and his family, and it's taken in the wider context that there have been several other deaths connected to the Port in recent years, and we know Auckland Council is now reviewing those deaths and how things are going at the Port, and we're expecting the results of that audit early next year.
Thanks, Nita. Nita Blake-Person there, who was in court where Auckland Ports has paid a fine, as she said, of more than $500,000 for the role it played in the death of one of its workers. Meanwhile, the freight backlog at Ports of Auckland is turning into a serious safety issue, according to truckies, with hundreds of freight containers being driven to their destinations after ships have been forced to dock elsewhere. The National Transport Forum says a freighter carrying 1,300 containers is having to divert to Northport near Whangarei because of delays at Ports of Auckland, and all of those containers will have to be trucked back down to Auckland. Ports of Auckland has been under fire over major delays in clearing cargo, and earlier this week it suspended its automated carriers that unload containers after one robot went rogue and crashed. Forum spokesperson Nick Leggett explains why it's a logistical nightmare.
You're going to have 1,300 Auckland-bound containers in Whangarei on the 6th of December. Those will have to move by road, which means probably around 2,600 truck movements to and from Auckland to Whangarei, and there's going to be, that they're substandard roads. The rail is out to Whangarei until the 11th of January, so these all have to go on the roads, and this is peak season. This is substandard roads and more people travelling because, it's going to have to go through and into the holiday period.
So the safety issue is actually on the roads. They're having to transport the containers. And by containers, we're talking about those big...
20-foot containers, yeah, two of them on a truck, usually. This is just one example of where a ship has had to go to Northport in Whangarei because it couldn't hang around waiting to get into the ports of Auckland. But the bigger problem for New Zealand is if the next ship doesn't wait and goes back. There are imports on that ship, but it's also those ships take our exports away as well. This is critical for New Zealand. We are at the bottom of the world, obviously. At the bottom of the supply chain, we are easy to miss off, and it will create woes for us in terms of safety on roads. There will be fewer trucks probably in and around ports of Auckland for quite a while, but there'll be more on State Highway 1 between Whangarei and to Auckland and south into the Waikato as well.
Who is this on then? If you're saying that this is a serious safety concern, who takes responsibility for it? Is it the Ports of Auckland?
I don't think it is the Ports of Auckland. As I say, this is symptomatic of a major problem, and New Zealand does need to get a grip of it. So I think to blame one port or one shipping line is wrong. We are feeling the effects of a congested really a worldwide supply chain that, as a result of COVID, is under real pressure. What we've got to do, though, as a country, we've written to the Ministry of Transport in the last couple of days to say this, is that we've got to actually get a grip. We've got to understand where the pressures are and try and anticipate them, and that means involving different industries, freight forwarders, ports, road transport, rail, and getting them together around the table to try and understand where the pinch points are going to be. We have to get a grip. Most of us take for absolute granted the fact that goods get to us. We order something online or we go to the supermarket, that is under pressure. And we do need to underline that, Lisa, because it doesn't seem that that's got through to the right people in government, and we do need to see this taken more seriously.
But when you talk about getting together and talking about it, people listening will think that's a lot of white noise and flapping jaws. If there is one single thing that you could do to make this better, what would it actually be?
Well, the thing to remember is this is a chain. So while it might sound like motherhood and apple pie to want to get people together, chains only work when each link is functioning. What I would say is we need to recognise it's peak season. We need to get rail working in pinch points, particularly in getting empty containers back to where they need to do to be loaded to go out for export. Getting the link between, it's not just Auckland and it's not just the Golden Triangle. This is nationwide. It's getting the freight available for the inter-island ferries and for rail generally. We've seen pinch points at other ports. It's about getting that capacity and getting those empty containers off ports to their destination so they can be unloaded and then get freight back into them and get them to their next destination, because there are problems all around the country. People are screaming out for empty containers. If we don't have that, our economy effectively can grind to a halt. So I would say it's about container supply is one thing, but getting people talking is really important because we've got to anticipate where the problems are going to be at peak season.
Okay, so this ship's being diverted up north because the Auckland port can't fit it in. And then you're going to load all this stuff onto trucks and send it back down to Auckland. There's got to be a cost involved in that. Do you know how much it is and who ends up paying for it?
Huge cost, and ultimately it will be the importers that pay, because the shipping line have said that this is a force majeure. They couldn't do anything about it. Therefore, the cost falls on the people who own the freight. So just to give you an idea, it costs about $120 to move a container from the ports of Auckland around Auckland, to a destination around Auckland. I know that cost to move a container from Northport to Auckland or south could be as much as 10 times that. And that, at a time when the owners of that freight can probably least afford that cost, they're going to have that heaped on them, and ultimately that'll fall onto consumers. So, it's not just a case of us not being able to get our goods, it's a case of actually they could be more expensive.
And that is Nick Leggett from the National Transport Forum. It is almost 18 minutes past 5 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Keen for your feedback on all of that. Ports of Auckland has been fined $500,000, just over, for health and safety failures and its role in the death of a young dad who was killed in a straddle carrier crash. Also, their ongoing freight problems, as you would have heard in that interview. You can text us on 2101, tweet us at checkpoint@rnz or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. It's too risky to let the Pakistan men's cricket team train while in managed isolation. That's the Director General of Health's conclusion after 10 team members have tested positive for COVID-19. It means they'll have a little more than a week to train before their first T20 match against the Black Caps on the 18th of December. That's if all of them are let out. As well as positive cases, the team also broke managed isolation rules by mingling during their first few days. Dr Ashley Bloomfield says that means there's a chance of the virus spreading if he grants them a training exemption.
Ultimately, I've got the responsibility for the overall public health, and so including in the community, and so I just felt on balance there was that residual risk and that it was safest not to have any training for the period of their managed isolation.
All things being equal, they would do 14 days isolation and they would have been due out around, I think it's the 8th of December, which would be about Tuesday of next week. Is that going to happen? Will the whole team be released at the same time, or what's going to happen?
The vast majority of the team are on track for being released then, all going well with the day 12 testing, but there will be some who are close contacts of those original cases, the ones that we've already identified, and they will need to stay through for a full sort of 14-day period. And the ones who are cases need to have spent at least 10 days and been symptom-free for 72 hours before they can be released.
So some of the squad won't make it out?
Not immediately, but the vast majority of them are on track for that, all going well for the remainder of their managed isolation. And I should say there is a reasonable period of, I think, somewhere between 8 and 10 days before their first match for them to train once they've finished managed isolation.
So worst case scenario, how long will the longest stayer from the team be in managed isolation? Based on your current infections? Well,
based on the current infections, if there were any close contacts of the person identified at day 6, then those close contacts would need to stay for a full 14 days from that point in time. So there may be people who are in there till day 20, but I'm not sure if there are any close contacts, given that, again, after those initial breaches, at the start of the stay, I think that there's been a much higher level of compliance, or they have been compliant with the requirements.
Anyone else showing symptoms?
Not at this point, but of course, in addition to the testing, day 9 and then day 12, there are daily symptom checks as well. So far, so good there.
Do you think that the tests that were taken beforehand were accurate, given the high numbers of infection?
Well, I can't really comment on the accuracy of the tests done before they came, but I can on the accuracy of the tests that we do here, and I think we've got fantastic testing capacity, and also our labs are doing a great job of identifying all the cases that arrive.
Do we need to change anything in terms of how we're managing these teams coming in?
Look, I think the main thing, perhaps that this particular incident emphasises is that the obligations on anyone travelling to New Zealand, whether they are Kiwis returning or whether they are sports teams here with the potential for a training exemption, is that there are really strict criteria and strict obligations on them that the expectation is there they'll comply with. And that is for their own safety and health, not just the health of the workers there and the wider public. So I think this really emphasises the point.
But do you need the hassle with this? Not to put too fine a point on it. These are not critical workers. They're not surgeons. They're not delivering necessary health care. They are professional sports people, and they seem to be taking up a lot of time and resources. Should we be bothering with it?
Well, I think we've got a very good process now for getting these teams here, for seeing them through managed isolation. I think that our health and other staff down in Christchurch have done a fantastic job with a range of teams this year, and that has meant we have had the opportunity and privilege really of watching live sport here in New Zealand. I think people appreciate that, but so saying, they also expect the teams coming here to to live with the rules and to play their part, and that's certainly our expectation.
So is it worth it, do you reckon? And given the time of yours that it's taking up as well?
Well, we're all learning to do things in this very different environment in 2020, and this is one of the things, again, I think we're fortunate as a country we can entertain these sorts of options and having live sport. So I think it's worth it. It's particularly worth it if it all goes smoothly. It doesn't always go smoothly, but we're certainly used to making good decisions and keeping people safe.
That was Dr Ashley Bloomfield there. He thinks it's worth it. Do you think it's worth it? Text us on 2101. Central Otago fruit growers are rubbishing claims they're turning down New Zealanders for local fruit picking work as they'd prefer cheap foreign labour. It follows union concerns that plenty of people are applying for jobs but are waiting weeks for replies if they get them at all. Orchard owners have been calling for the government to allow in more seasonal workers from Pacific countries to help with the summer fruit harvest. Tess Brunton has more.
Stephen Darling runs Darling's Fruit in Ettrick, Central Otago, growing mainly apples and apricots. He's had a large number of job applications and says they do their best to get back to people as soon as they can.
Of those that we receive, we assess those and we respond back to those. We do background checks as best we can, and we endeavour to select the people that we think are going to be best suited for the job. And not everyone is, and unfortunately I think perhaps there's some misconceptions about horticultural work, about orchard work, and that's why we do our best to make sure people are suited to those roles.
Amalgamated Workers Union Southern Secretary Calvin Fisher says overseas workers and New Zealanders may receive the same pay rate, but orchards find other benefits from hiring further from home.
They charge the islanders up to $150 a week for accommodation. They've only got I think it's 32 hours a minimum. They don't have to pay KiwiSaver, and they move them around as required. So, there's clearly business benefits in having island labour here.
The government previously announced 2,000 additional RSE workers will be able to fly in early next year to help with the harvest, along with incentives for unemployed New Zealanders to take on seasonal work. Sid Birtles manages Remarkable Orchards in Roxburgh and says they usually employ New Zealanders first, with peak cherry and apricot picking and packing hitting next month.
But whoever comes through the door, and quite often we're generally wanting to employ them. The RSE lot, this nonsense about this 2,000 people coming in the country, that's a fantastic first step. It's a step too late for us generally. It's finished for the stone fruit season.
He disagrees the industry is after cheap foreign labour.
It's rubbish. We're obliged to pay minimum wage anyway. and that's across the board, no matter who you are. There are incentives for people to encourage them to do more, because there's certainly urgency in the picking and the time frame. The fruit doesn't wait for tomorrow in some cases.
Summer Fruit New Zealand chairman Tim Jones says the industry has been overwhelmed with applications after putting out a call for help with harvesting, but he agrees they should do better.
Growers could obviously be doing a better job, and the message needs to go out to growers that, really it is polite at a minimum just to respond to the inquiries they're getting, and to give people a little bit more information about, what jobs are available, what the conditions are, and when those jobs start.
Summerfruit NZ has appointed a seasonal labour coordinator to help the industry. He says there will be plenty of work, just not quite yet. And with an inundation of applications, Tim Jones says the fruit industry should have enough workers to keep the harvest from going pear-shaped. For Checkpoint, Cortes Brunton, Tēnei.
The government will seek advice on whether the current rules safeguarding the use of facial recognition technology are sufficient. A new report has raised serious concerns over what it perceives as a regulation gap, determining how the government uses facial recognition. But the Green Party and National are on opposite sides when it comes to whether their recommendations should be implemented. Harry Locke reports.
The report, released today, found that the government now has the infrastructure for mass or targeted surveillance using facial recognition technology. But it warns there isn't the regulation in place to control just how the technology is used. The director of the Centre for Law and Policy in Emerging Technologies, Colin Gavigan, is concerned about the algorithms which can match a face to already held information like a photograph in a database. He says such systems have gone wrong in other countries.
There certainly have been areas where algorithmic systems have gone kind of worryingly wrong. And one of the ways this happens is in respect to things like how bias can creep into the system. If the algorithmic system's trained on data that says that people of a particular ethnicity, for example, are more likely to be criminals or terrorists, then that is likely to inform results of the system.
In its 15 recommendations to the government, the Victoria University report calls for the use of facial recognition to be more transparent and with more oversight. Professor Gavigan agrees algorithm systems need to be scrutinised.
What we've been calling for in my team, and I think it links quite nicely to some of the conclusions from this report, is that we need some kind of oversight mechanism. If nothing else, just to give the public trust and confidence in how these systems are being used.
Caleb Moses is a data scientist and a member of Te Mana Rārona, the Māori Data Sovereignty Network. He says the use of facial recognition has specific implications for Māori.
At the moment, not much is understood about, how we can expect facial recognition algorithms to behave when, say, they see a tāmoko or a moko kauai or a mata ora.
He says questions remain around where the data is being stored and how it's being used. The review recommends Māori representation in the oversight of how the police use facial recognition. The Justice spokesperson for the Green Party, Golriz Garaman, says she has deep reservations around the use of the technology.
When we're talking about locking people up and sanctioning them criminally, we really need to make sure that the technology we're relying on is as accurate as something like DNA. And this is far away from that.
She wants the government to consider implementing all 15 recommendations. In a statement, the Digital Economy and Communications Minister David Clark says he'll be looking into the report's findings.
As facial recognition is a rapidly developing technology, I'll be seeking advice on the current safeguards in place and whether any more regulations or oversight are needed to ensure any use of the technology meets the ethical considerations and transparency the public expect.
But National spokesperson on digital media, Melissa Lee, is cautious about introducing more regulations.
We already have a privacy framework, and I think until technology lands, I don't think we really need too many regulations to stifle growth of the technology.
Furthermore, the Privacy Commissioner, John Edwards, believes there is sufficient law in place which already covers biometric data.
With the new powers that we have under the Privacy Act to enforce that, the Commissioner can issue compliance notices if, for example, a system is deployed which is collecting disproportionate amounts of information.
He says what concerns him is the increasing retail availability of the technology to private companies and does think a more prescriptive framework would be useful. For Checkpoint, Harry Locke.
up on Checkpoint on RNZ National, we have a special investigation into the services available for severely disabled children and their families. The City Rail Link's latest worker, named after Dame Whina Cooper, arrives in Auckland, and a warning for pet owners ahead of Christmas after Kobe the pug eats a sword and washes it down with a whale. Yep, we've got all those details. We would love your feedback on anything you've heard on the program. Text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or there's always the good old-fashioned email, checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Time for the headlines now with Susanna.
The police say Auckland businesswoman Elizabeth Zhong was killed in her home and her body then placed in her car boot last weekend. Investigators have formally identified the 55-year-old and say they're continuing a scene examination at her home in Sunny Hills, where she was last seen a week ago. Local government New Zealand hopes that moves to replace the Tauranga Council with a commission will get the city back on track. Minister Nanaya Mahuta has notified the council of her intention to address significant governance problems among councillors, and it has 10 working days to respond. Microbiologist Susie Wiles says the Pakistan men's cricket team should be kept from training while they remain in isolation. The Director General of Health, Dr Ashley Bloomfield, has denied an exemption, meaning the team can't train until they complete managed isolation. There have been 6 acute cases of COVID-19 within the 53-member squad, and Dr Wiles says some who have tested negative may still be incubating the virus. Digital Economy Minister David Clark is to seek advice on whether further safeguards and oversight are needed for facial recognition technology following a critical report. Victoria University's study calls for more controls on the use of such software, saying the country's state surveillance systems are too powerful. Central Otago orchardists are asking people to keep applying for fruit picking jobs despite union concerns that some are facing a long wait for responses if they get one at all. The industry has come under fire after calling for workers to help with the harvest, only to turn people away. Central Otago growers say they will need all hands on deck this season without the usual overseas workers. A multi-million-dollar piece of tunnelling equipment has been blessed and given the name of Dame Whina Cooper in Auckland today. The boring machine will dig out 2 tunnels from Mount Eden to the city centre as part of the City Rail Link project. The daughter of the Māori land rights champion, Hinerangi Cooper, says City Rail Link workers can feel reassured in Dame Whina's company. Those are the latest news headlines from RNZ National. Our next news and weather update is at 6.
Thanks, Susanna. If you're just joining us, this is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen, and it's time now for business news with Nicholas Poynton. Nicholas, you're telling me Toyota New Zealand is reigniting discussions around a fee-based scheme. Well, what is that? Some people will ask. And what are they talking about?
Well, I think we'll start with that fee-based scheme. Remember, it was a policy that was sort of tabled by the previous government, by 2 of the coalition partners, and that's a situation where you put a levy on high-emitting vehicles or cars, gas guzzlers, and you use the money that's generated from that levy to subsidise low-emitting cars, so think hybrid vehicles or electric vehicles. But that deal, if we remember last year, that was scuttled by the then coalition partner New Zealand First, didn't receive their backing. That policy did not get across the line. So the head of Toyota New Zealand, though, they say that there is an urgent need for a fee-based scheme to make electrified vehicles more affordable. He says that the country, if they don't act on this, it will fail to follow through on our Paris Agreement commitments to be carbon neutral by 2050 if we don't slash the emissions of our vehicle fleet. He says that other countries have already taken action on this, and if New Zealand doesn't follow suit, we could be a dumping ground for other countries' gas guzzlers. The hyperbolic term that he used was that we could become the Cuba of the South Pacific. However, in his statement, he didn't really go on to explain what he actually meant by that or how that would actually even happen. But look, that aside, the CEO said in a statement that he's made contact with the Transport Minister, Michael Wood, about the need for financial incentives for low-emitting vehicles because low emissions do carry a hefty price tag. Those electric vehicles and hybrid vehicles, they do tend to be out of the price range of most New Zealanders, but to make them affordable, well, the manufacturer says they're not going to carry a cost, so a fee-based scheme would be needed to sort of subsidise the cost of those vehicles.
And there's not as many wafting around on the second-hand market as well.
Yeah, that's the other thing. A lot of the new vehicles that do come into this country, they are not many of them have made it through to the secondary market, and then you have those imports, and they can be quite undesirable because with the hybrid vehicles in particular, their battery batteries, they're not recyclable. So after about 250,000 Ks, you need to replace that. That's an expensive job to do. So some of the second-hand vehicles aren't as appealing. But look, it's worth noting that Toyota does have a lot of interest in this. They would benefit from a fee-based scheme. It is the biggest seller of hybrid vehicles in this country. So a fee-based scheme would allow it to bring down the price of those vehicles, so it would be able to compete against its competitors' sort of petrol equivalents. It also may be competing against their own petrol cars. But it's also worth adding that their big gas guzzlers, the Toyota Hilux, that was the second highest selling car in New Zealand last year. It's well on track to be the second highest selling car this year again. And the majority of the sales of that car goes to the commercial sector. So think construction work, people working construction sites, builders, farmers. And even if you introduced a fee-based scheme, you can probably imagine that the demand for those cars wouldn't be affected. Those people who, realistically, they do need those cars to do UT type things, that they're still going to always need them, right?
That's a technical term, UT type things.
Exactly,
yes.
They're still going to need them. So you can imagine those people will be pretty frustrated by the fact that they'll be the ones who'll be essentially subsidising those people in the cities who are getting the electric and hybrid vehicles.
And Toyota is still pushing those vehicles hard. I mean, they've got a new marketing campaign as well. Hey, have you got some intel on us?
Oh, well, yes.
What
and
intel have you got here,
This is
Nicholas?
also probably worth mentioning that when this statement came out, I did give the spokesperson a call and just to find out what car that the chief executive of Toyota drives. And he owns a Toyota Supra, which is the company's top-end high-performance vehicle. It has a 3-litre petrol-driven powered twin-turbo engine. But I have been told that he does cycle through some other cars. He doesn't drive that car all the time.
Very interesting, Nicholas. Now, let's jump ahead to the markets. What's been happening today?
Yeah, sure. The NZX, it closed down 17.5 points to 12,649. Our dollar, it's at 70.6 US cents, 95 Australian, 52.5 British pence. And Bitcoin, it has made back its losses from last week and then some. It's now back to 27,283 New Zealand dollars for a single Bitcoin.
Wow, those are some big numbers. Thanks, Nicholas. Nicholas Poynton with Business News there. The government's now reserving about 150 beds a fortnight in managed isolation for people having to rush back to New Zealand because of emergencies. And it's also broadened the criteria to jump ahead in the queue. Places in managed isolation are in extremely high demand heading into Christmas and the summer holidays, with some families unable to book a spot in time to see dying relatives. Previously, only New Zealand citizens and resident visa holders with an imminent threat to their life or a serious risk to their health could be given priority for an MIQ spot. That's now been extended to include people coming home to care for a child. There's also now a second lower priority category that includes people visiting an immediate relative who is dying, people who can't legally stay where they are, or people coming here to provide specialist health services or if they're needed for national security purposes. I asked MBIE's Deputy Chief Executive of Managed Isolation, Megan Main, why they've freed up the beds now.
We've had incredibly high demand from returning Kiwis and permanent residents in the lead up to Christmas and summer. So from the outset, we had a process for people who urgently needed to come home. This was an extremely high threshold and it was limited to imminent threat to a citizen's life or health. Now we've added a second group of categories that covers a wider range of criteria, caring for dependent, if someone can't legally stay where they are, and the only options to return to New Zealand, or to visit a close relative who's dying. It's still a really high bar, and it is to be used as a last resort, and there is still a requirement to complete 14 days managed isolation.
But in essence, you're going to hold open some spaces so that people who have an emergency have an option to apply for, well, I suppose some relief and to get into managed isolation and quarantine faster.
That's right. We're confident that we can allocate these 150 rooms per fortnight now because we've had the new allocation system in place for just on a month. It gives us much better data, which gives us much better confidence in our planning assumptions. Over the last 4 weeks, we've seen some vouchers released when people's plans change or flights change. We've also seen some of the the no-shows where someone doesn't get on a plane and therefore doesn't enter managed isolation. So this gives us the capacity to allocate those 150 rooms confidently per fortnight.
Can you be sure of that though? Because obviously some of this space is because people don't turn up, and you won't know that till the very last minute. Have you got some overflow space that you can utilise?
Yeah, so we do get some of that visibility early on, and we also are seeing some quite consistent patterns in people's travel behaviour, which is helping to give us assurance. But we do have some contingency set aside, and contingency is for emergencies, and we can go into that a small amount for a short period of time without risking the operational safety of the isolation system.
How many beds is that, Megan, in the contingency?
So that covers things like rooms being cleaned, all the way through to if a plane can't take off and we actually can't move people from one city to another. So it's a broad range of contingencies, even including if there's a fire in the facility. So that's it does fluctuate, Lisa, but it's roughly 400 rooms.
Okay, so if we look at the criteria now to apply for an emergency allocation and managed isolation and quarantine, it is a tiered priority list. So, for example, a person who personally needs medical attention for some serious risk to their health, they will get priority above someone who wants to come home to visit a dying parent. I know that these things are never easy, but how did you decide on the order of priority, and who decided that? It's a balancing act, and we know a lot of Kiwis are in incredibly distressing situations overseas, and we feel for them. This pandemic has impacted so many people's lives in so many ways, and we saw that here during Alert Level 4. And that's why we're really pleased to be able to expand the criteria. But the first priority is that life and safety of an individual overseas who needs to come home. So ahead of visiting a dying relative? That's correct. And with our 150 rooms, we are hoping to get as many people home as possible who fit those emergency criteria. And remember, it is a high bar. So who made that decision? And by that I mean, was it a single person who came up with those categories, or did you do it with a committee of people? Who made the final call? So some of it was based on the trends we've been seeing in the last 4 weeks or so, where we've seen the requests coming in. We also see this through our exemption process, but ultimately this was worked through by officials with the Minister for COVID Response. So how many people have you had applying for an emergency allocation, and how many of those were approved or facilitated? So as of a couple of days ago, we've had just over 1,200 requests for emergency allocations, and we've had 91 approvals. And that is Megan Main. It is about 17 minutes to 6. I'm Lisa Owen, and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Do get in touch about anything you've heard on the program this evening. You can text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Drought-stricken Auckland is staring down the barrel of a hot summer after a lengthy and punishing dry spell this year. The super city will be released from the shackles of household water restrictions later this month, but authorities say it hasn't escaped its water woes just yet. The region's dams are just 72% full, when they're usually 90% full at this time of the year. Our reporter Jean Bell and camera operator Dan Cook went to check out whether the city's water supply will last the summer.
In late May, Upper Mangatawhiri Dam in the Whanau Ranges was an abysmal 38% full. You couldn't even get a boat onto the dam as the water around the launching ramp was too shallow. Today the dam is 67% full. It is usually around 98% full at this time of year. James Talbot is the operations controller at Watercare. He can get a boat on the water now, but says that's not necessarily cause for celebration.
The dam levels, particularly in the Whanau Ranges and at Mangatawhiri, where we are today, have come up a bit, not a huge amount, but they have certainly increased. We were down well below 50% for a while there.
Auckland Council is scrambling to resolve the super city's water woes. Mandatory water restrictions were enforced in May. People were asked to take 4-minute showers and were banned from using outdoor hoses and water blasters. The council has splashed out $224 million on infrastructure to increase take from the Waikato River and other sources, including the Hayes Creek Dam and a new treatment plant in Pukikohi. Mr Talbot says full-up dams would be ideal, but this increased supply and decreased demand has helped keep things afloat.
The draw off the lakes has been significantly reduced. And that's largely down to the great job Aucklanders have been doing.
But Mr Talbot says Aucklanders can't afford to take their eye off their water usage.
For me personally, I mean, the lakes are still lower than what they would have been prior, so it's still going to be really important for people to maintain those good habits that have been instilled over the last few months.
And he's got some water-saving tips for Aucklanders.
I'm a big fan of the additional buckets in the shower, that's for sure, for use elsewhere around the home or house. In addition to that, I think particularly on people that are on, that have high pressure coming out their taps, just being really vigilant about how long those taps are open for and keeping them closed when they're not in use.
Watercare Acting Chief Executive Marlon Bridge says while things have improved, Auckland's not off the hook yet.
Well, right now we're at a comfortable level in terms of where the lakes are at. And demand's been exceptionally good, with Aucklanders saving over 7 billion litres to date. The weather forecasts are also showing positive signs compared to May earlier this year. But in terms of supply, we're well on track with the additional supply, non-dam related. So things are looking positive. But we're not out of the woods yet.
He says Aucklanders have stepped up to the challenge of saving water and they need to continue that.
I think there needs to be this ongoing push that water is a precious resource, and I think people are starting to get that. In Auckland we haven't had what we've had to date, but then we haven't had the biggest drought in the history of Auckland. So for me it is, water is a precious resource and we need to treat it with respect.
Water restrictions in Auckland have been eased just in time for summer. But are we out of the woods yet? We hit the streets to find out what Aucklanders think.
Forecast saying we're going to have a long, dry summer. If we use it all now, won't be any left in the summer, and we'll have more restrictions as we move forward into January and February.
We were driving out to Huia and went past the Nihitopa Dam and pulled in and saw that, it looked really, really low, and you could see a whole lot of brown earth that typically wasn't there, and kind of made us realise that it was a situation and it was quite serious.
Ideal would be 90%, but that's very unlikely to happen. But we still need to be respectful, save water, not waste it, not wash our cars every weekend.
Phil Goff, the Mayor of Auckland, is confident there is enough water in the tank to see the city through the summer.
I have assurances from Watercare that with the extra investment we've put in, new water treatment plants at Pukikohi, about to open in Papakura, further extended in Tuakau in the new year, we will increase overall within the last 18 months our water supply to the city by 96 million litres a day. That, together with the savings that Aucklanders have made, have meant that we haven't suffered what might have been the case given that we had the worst drought in the history of the city.
He's confident further more severe restrictions won't be slapped back on the city.
We never know what the weather is going to deliver. Every time I'm told that there's going to be rain, sometimes I see, as we did in September and October, some of the driest months on record for the city. But on the combined effect of greater water supply and conservation measures by Aucklanders, I'm confident that we can get through the situation without severe water restrictions.
Aucklanders have been given one small reprieve. The hand hose is back in a couple of weeks, but it has to be used with a trigger nozzle. But with a long, hot summer looming, residents of the city of Sails are being reminded to keep a lid on their water consumption. Mō te hotako o te ahi nei ko Jean Bell TNA.
Well, next up is a super boring story. The City Rail Link project's latest worker has arrived in Auckland, a multi-million-dollar boring machine that can gnaw through 32 metres of ground every day. Named after Māori rights champion Dame Whina Cooper, the towering tunnel maker was unveiled in Mount Eden this morning. Our reporter Katie Todd and visual journalist Simon Rogers was there.
Unboxed, rebuilt and blessed. It's the $13.5 million piece of custom-made equipment, created in Germany and China, that's soon set to slice 2 underground train tunnels and the travel times of Auckland's traffic-weary residents.
This machine is just going to do remarkable things. 3.2 kilometres of tunnelling over the next 2 years, working 24/7. No rest for the tunnel boring machine, and it will displace up to 1,500 tonnes of soil and rock a day.
Mayor Phil Goff's excitement shared by a keen crowd of City Rail Link workers, councillors, iwi and politicians who gathered in Mount Eden this morning for a glimpse. It's tradition every big tunnel boring machine, or TBM, gets a powerful woman's name. This one, thanks to internet voters, bears the name of the Māori Rats champion Dame Whina Cooper, who led Māori land protesters on a hikoi from Te Hapua to Parliament. Her daughter Henirangi Cooper commends the naming as a brave choice and says City Rail Link workers can feel reassured in Dame Whina's company.
She's a bit like Moses, in the Old Testament. When they said, he's going to go through the sea and open up the sea and the people will walk, that's what she's doing.
Deputy Prime Minister Grant Robertson says Dame Whina's spirit is reflected in both the mana of the machine and what it will achieve for the city.
Infrastructure projects are about reducing congestion so people can move around more. They can pick up Dame Whina's spirit of being a businesswoman, a farmer. But they're also about the way we think about our communities. They bring our communities together.
Behind me is just the front section of the machine, which will be 130 metres long in total, weighing 910 tonnes. In April, it will disappear under the ground in Auckland, and it won't emerge until late 2021. The remaining parts of the boring machine will be built over the next 4 months. Work is also underway to build the first 50 metres of the tunnel from Mount Eden, so the fully assembled machine can be slotted in and set off on its big underground journey. Transport Minister Michael Wood says the City Rail Link shows what can happen when mana whenua and local and central government all work together.
I'm also very pleased about the role that projects like this play in our rebuild from COVID-19, providing real jobs and opportunities for thousands of Aucklanders through the construction of this project.
5,000 members of the public have snapped up tickets to see Dame Whina Cooper this Sunday at a boring day out. The City Rail Link is due for completion in 2024. For Checkpoint, ko Katie Todd, tēnei.
This is a tale of a pug versus a whale and a warning to all pet owners ahead of Christmas. Unbeknown to Kobe's owner, the greedy pug had gobbled up a few things he shouldn't. That put him off his real food and brought on a nasty bout of vomiting and diarrhoea. His human mum took him to Animates Vet Care in Palmerston North. Now, there's really no delicate way to put this, but when vet Nikki Stone checked out places the sun don't shine, she found some Lego, and that led to x-rays and evidence of other objects, and that meant surgery. Vet Nikki picks up the story.
I took another x-ray just before we went into surgery to make sure that they hadn't moved. So I knew that most of these things were in the stomach, and pulled out, I think you might have seen in the photo, there's a hook. If you buy socks, there's little plastic hooks on them. There were several of those. There was a pirate sword. There were 3 tyres, I think, off of Lego toys. Bits and pieces, they were all wound together. Anyway, I cleared the stomach, and we were pretty happy with that, and I closed it up. And what we always do if we have had to enter the abdomen of a dog who's eaten the wrong thing is just check further down for anything else, and there were more tyres in his intestines, which also had to come out and go into that kidney dish.
Nikki, don't forget the whale.
Oh, and I forgot the whale. That came out of the stomach. It was swimming around in the stomach. Couldn't get through to the intestines. It got caught up in the hook, I think.
And I think this is almost like a memory recall game. And there was a couple of balloon toys in there as well, yes. I believe.
Yep. So too many things to count, really. I was just, obviously, my concern was with my patient. So one of the nurses had the kidney dish, and I was, as quickly as I could, just removing all these things. And it was only really when the nurses took it away and washed out all the grass and separated that we could see what all the different things were.
I know this is a really serious business, but it sounds like you almost had a piñata or a Christmas cracker there with what you were getting out of him. I just need to know, for my understanding, some idea of scale here, Nikki. These were truck sort of tyres from a toy. What sort of size are we talking for some of these objects?
Our friend Kobe, the pug himself, was only 7 kilos, so he's small. That's not much bigger than a cat. The tyres were, what do I have to say there, as big as? I'm looking around the room for something. The biggest one was as big as like the inside of a roll of sellotape.
Gotcha. So he's munched up a few kids' toys.
Yes, mostly things from children's toys. And what I imagine is because the kids have played with them, their fingers are a little bit sweaty, a little bit smelly. Maybe they've been eating food, and that makes them very, very attractive for a pug.
Well, that's my next question. Is this common behaviour? Is it common for this particular type of dog, or what? You leave anything lying around, a dog will eat it?
I've certainly done it for pugs before. No, there's some breeds are very much more likely to do that than others. And in fact, the specialists are the Labradors. They'll eat all sorts of things. I took out a football sock from a Labrador, and I was the third vet to have taken out a football sock. So that was just one dog. So they're known to eat wrong things. Pugs are pretty good at it as well. But other dogs, other breeds, less so.
So I don't mean to be rude, Nikki, but it's the greedy ones, the greedy dog breeds.
That's absolutely.
Okay. Now, the most important thing is, how is Kobe doing?
Well, I'm delighted that the next day, within a few hours of finishing surgery, he was feeling so much better that he even started eating. And when I took his sutures out at 10 days post-surgery, you wouldn't think anything was wrong. He was running around, happy, eating and drinking. And all the children have got all of their toys in one safe room with a gate up in front of it, and they're not allowed to come out where the doggy is.
Well, I feel there's a bit of a warning in here, Nikki, because we're coming up to Christmas, so people will have potentially a few toys that they're unwrapping and a few new knickknacks. What do you say to pet owners and greedy dogs?
If you've got dogs that you know are inclined to take that sort of thing, Christmas is a time when, as vets, we do see dogs eating the wrong thing, like children's toys. We more often see dogs who have given themselves pancreatitis from pinching lamb bones around the barbecue, and sausages and things that they shouldn't have. So remembering that just because it's Christmas doesn't mean it actually is good for the dog who's salivating at the barbecue to have heaps of sausages and bones and things.
And keep the chocolate on the top shelf.
Absolutely. They don't think, it made me sick last year, I won't do it this year.
And that was vet Nikki Stone, and we'll put pictures of Kobe and the contents of his belly up on our Facebook page. You can check it out. Let's move on to some of your feedback now on the very serious issue of the death of a young port worker, 23-year-old Lambom Dyer, who died in 2018 after an accident with a straddle carrier. The port was fined $500,000 today. This person says unless Ports of Auckland reduces the times required to get the bonus, the drivers will find ways of disconnecting the tipping warning. Also on the issue of the freight gnarl up there and ships being diverted to Northport and then the containers having to come by road back to Auckland. This listener says one ship diverts from Auckland to Northport and there's a crisis. What happens when all Auckland ships go to Northport, as some people are so keen to see? Hopefully this is a wake-up call that moving to Northport is a dumb idea. Another person says, why are these containers being moved by road? We have a rail network capable of moving 3 times as much in any given day. It's a no-brainer, they say. Well, the problem there is the rail line is out until January 11th. And someone else says, surely logistics issues that Nick Leggett is rabbiting on about are the day-to-day core business in this industry. Why does he need the government to step in?
RNZ News at 6, ngā mihi nui ko Susana Leata with DNA. The Director General of Health believes it's too risky for the Pakistan cricketers to train while in managed isolation in Christchurch. Dr Ashley Bloomfield has confirmed he will not be granting an exemption that would have allowed the team to leave their hotel in groups for training. He says team members returned 4 acute positive results for COVID-19 on day 1 of testing and 2 further cases at days 3 and 6. Dr Bloomfield has told Checkpoint the risk of cross-infection is too great.
If they started training now and they had another case that was identified through the day 12 testing, that would really present a problem for the team and potentially create risk for staff and also, of course, could even jeopardise their tour.
Dr Bloomfield says further testing of the team at day 9 has provided negative results. The police are appealing for sightings of an Auckland businesswoman's black Land Rover as they investigate her death. It's believed 55-year-old Elizabeth Zhong was killed in her home last Friday afternoon before being found dead in her car boot in Sunny Hills on Saturday. Speaking to media this afternoon, Acting Detective Inspector Sean Vickers said some people have come forward with information. He says the police want to hear from anyone else who saw possible suspicious activity around Elizabeth's Suzette Place home in Sunny Hills last Friday night or Saturday morning.
We'd be particularly appealing if you have seen Elizabeth's black Land Rover between that period of time. If you haven't already contacted police, please do. And I would like to say, no matter how small or insignificant a piece of information is that you think that you may have, please contact us.
Acting Detective Inspector Sean Vickers. A disability advocate says promised changes to the way family carers are paid hasn't changed the fundamental problems with the policy. The government's funded family care scheme ended in September, but advocates say the same assessment is still being used. Catherine Hutton reports.
Funded family care paid family members to care for a disabled relative. An independent disability advocate, Jane Carrigan, says under the new system, the assessment process remains the same and people are only paid for the time they spend on personal care of the disabled person and household management. She says there is still no recognition of the constant supervision or monitoring of people who are severely disabled, and there is no independent review of the assessment process. The ministry says it's awaiting the outcome of a pilot program running in the mid-central region. This is Catherine Hutton.
The country's local government association hopes the call to replace Tauranga's council with commissioners will get the governance of the rapidly growing city back on track. Local Government New Zealand backs Minister of Local Government Nanaia Mahuta's moves to appoint commissioners amid dysfunction and infighting at the council. Its president, Stuart Crosby, is a former mayor of Tauranga and supports the decision.
I understand it's a really tough job. It's tough in governance because of the growth pressures, but that's not an excuse for some of the behaviours that we've seen of this current council.
Stuart Crosby, the Local Government New Zealand president. The government has received an interim report from the Royal Commission into Historical Abuse in State and Faith-Based Care. The 4-year inquiry is investigating abuse in care between 1950 and 1999 and is the biggest Royal Commission in New Zealand's history. The report will set out interim findings and recommendations as well as key themes and common issues the inquiry has identified. Internal Affairs Minister Jan Tanetti says each phase of the inquiry will be of enormous significance to survivors. Cabinet will soon consider when to publicly release the report. The Greens are backing a major study which calls on the government to put more constraints around facial recognition technology. The Victoria University report out today says New Zealand's state surveillance systems are too powerful and lack the necessary safeguards. It suggests a biometrics commissioner be appointed. The Green MP Golriz Garman says the government needs to take that on board.
There's some really serious privacy issues at stake when this data is collected in terms of whether or not the public is giving permission for their data to be collected in this way and in the ways that it's then stored and shared, whether between government agencies or private entities.
Golriz Garman says such technology is also less reliable in recognising minority ethnic communities. Ports of Auckland has been fined $540,000 after a worker died in a crane accident. 23-year-old Laboom Dio was working the night shift in August as a straddle crane driver when the loader he was operating toppled over. He died in hospital. The District Court described Mr Dio's death as an entirely preventable tragedy. Ports of Auckland, which is owned by the Auckland Council, has taken full responsibility and is carrying out an audit of worker deaths. It's 5 minutes past 6. The West Indies have survived the opening onslaught from the Black Caps bowlers in the final session of Day 2 of the first cricket test in Hamilton. New Zealand declared on 519 for 7 after captain Kane Williamson scored his highest test score of 251 runs, and Kyle Jamieson brought up his first test half-century after the tea break. In reply, a short time ago, the West Indies were 28 without loss. The Warriors are confident the New Zealand borders will open in time for their round 5 game NRL game against Manly on April 9th. The Rugby League club announced today that they will be based in Australia from early January through March and then plan to return to Auckland's Mount Smart Stadium for at least 9 home games in 2021. Warriors Chief Executive Cameron George says even if borders open sooner, the club has committed to seeing out the first part of their season overseas.
We're so desperate to be here and play in front of our fans. We want to come back and share that excitement with our fans at some stage. Our eyes are set on that 9 April game here against Manly, so we're going to go to market with that. We're going to sell as if we're coming home.
Warriors Chief Executive Cameron George. The independent review into Gymnastics New Zealand in response to the exposure of unsafe and abusive practices in the sport, both historical and current, has now concluded the submission phase. The review team are expected to release their report in early February. That's the news.
Tonight on Nights, Darren Watson's Lexa mixtape. Country Life meets some budding North Otago earth scientists, average age about 9, burying their underpants to assess the health of the soil. It's called the Soil Your Undies program. Well, it would be, wouldn't it? And because Radio Hauraki made its first broadcast from somewhere in the Gulf on this day in 1966, we've got a Sonic Tonic dedicated to pirates. Might even talk like one, but only after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland, cloudy periods, rain around midday tomorrow. Auckland, Coromandel Peninsula, Bay of Plenty, cloudy periods but fine in Bay of Plenty tonight. A few showers everywhere from tomorrow afternoon. Waikato to Kapiti Coast, including central high country, fine spells, isolated light showers, rain from tomorrow afternoon. Gisborne, Hawke's Bay, Wellington, also Nelson and Marlborough, fine tonight, scattered rain tomorrow from late morning to evening south of Mahia. Bulla, Westland and Fiordland, periods of rain with some heavy falls and thunderstorms with hail tomorrow. Canterbury, Otago and Southland, fine tonight apart from a few showers in Southland and Otago, clearing eventually. Rain for a time tomorrow morning, then showers possibly thundery towards the coast, showers clearing inland by evening. Chatham Islands, cloudy periods with a few showers from tonight. RNZ National, it's 8 minutes past 6.
Thanks, Susanna. Kia ora anō. This is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. Tonight we have a special investigation into the families caring for some of the country's most vulnerable citizens. Even though they do it with love, looking after children with serious disabilities is a tough job. And the carers say the task is made even harder because they're being ignored by the government and those who are supposed to assist them. Catherine Hutton's been looking at the options and the struggles for severely disabled children and their families.
So when you move in, and you have all your
Christine Fleming is in the kitchen of her neat and tidy Auckland home, opening drawers and cupboards. She hasn't lost anything, and this isn't a cooking demonstration. This is Christine's way of explaining how the disability sector works. She opens the crockery cupboard. That's one part of disability. Her baking dishes, that's another. She flings open a cupboard. There's the saucepans. That's another. Then she gets to her kitchen drawers and pulls out the third drawer down. This, she says, represents those with high and very high needs.
Then you have this drawer. It's all important stuff, but none of it fits anywhere else. It's all individual, all different, and it doesn't fit anywhere else. Everyone's got one, and people constantly try to, I'll put it here, and every now and again you get it out and you think, I'll sort that and I'll try and put it everywhere else. And in the end people give up and go, it's that drawer. That is us. We don't fit anywhere else with the other disability groups. We don't fit anywhere else in society, and we're all very different, but all essential. And every now and again people pull us out and go, we're going to fix this, and they try, and then they go, no, too hard. Shut the drawer and walk away and leave us again.
Christine is mother to Justin, who has Williams syndrome. It's a genetic disorder which can cause problems with the heart, kidneys and other organs, as well as learning difficulties and intellectual disability. But Justin wasn't given that diagnosis until he was an adult. Until then, they only had a general label of genetic disorder. Only an estimated 200 New Zealanders have the syndrome. Justin is obsessed with planes and music. His room is filled with posters and models of planes.
Yeah, that's a Jimmy biplane.
Yes.
Yes.
So that was his, because he gets spoiled.
His condition meant Christine had to struggle to get support while coping with a high-needs child. And it's a system, she says, consistently ignores or fails to help those like her son. The symptoms of Williams syndrome affect different parts of the body. So Justin was under an array of specialists: kidney, heart, bowel, gastro, orthopaedic and eye doctors. But no one had overall responsibility. No one took all that information and looked at the total picture or talked to each other.
I could have an appointment in the morning one day and an appointment the next day at outpatients clinic, and then in amongst that there'd be an x-ray ordered. Now, if there was any sort of oversight plan, why couldn't have that all happened on the same morning? So we had one trip in there, one stress for him, seen this guy, seen that guy, had the x-ray, and then we're home and calm for the rest of the week. But it was never like that.
In constant pain, Justin would scream and scream. He didn't sleep through the night until he was 5.5, and then only because he was in a drug-induced coma to stop his seizures. On top of that, he was stressed by operations, needles and medication.
You're so chaotic, it's really hard to step out of that and say, hey, guys, this is shit, this isn't working, you're making our lives a crazy disaster. Can something else be sorted here? Because you're too busy in it to have, and you're not sleeping and you're worried yourself sick because you've got this kid that's constantly trying to die on you, and it's like, so it's just chaos.
Yeah, really fast and slow, and then speed up really hard and not.
Life is organised around Justin, but everything stops immediately if he appears unwell or is unsettled. He can deteriorate quickly if action to resolve problems isn't taken straight away. Leaving the house presents its own set of challenges. He can't be far from a toilet, and because he has celiac disease, Christine prepares all his food separately and takes it with them. And all of this life has to fit into bureaucratic boxes for assessment, for support and funding. Christine's whole life looking after her son is shoved into a bureaucratic description category: personal care.
You can say I'm being a hygiene, something or other, something else. You know, lovely soft labels. I'm cleaning up shit. And here's an accident. It's everywhere. I have poo everywhere. Down his legs, up his back, on his knickers, on his trousers, on his socks, on his shoes, all over the toilet, all over the floor, halfway up the wall, because he's tried to clean it up himself if I haven't got to him in time and he has really bad liquid diarrhoea. I don't care what you want to call that pretty. I'm cleaning up a massive amount of poo everywhere. And that is an hour's job, because I've done it so many times, it takes me an hour. Why would I choose to do that as a lifestyle choice, you know? I do it because he's my son and I love him, and he has a problem with that. He's not doing it deliberately, he can't help it. You know, it is not easy. It is quite often very simple. It is very monotonous. It's very repetitive, but it is not easy.
Christine won't put Justin into care. And though she dedicates her life to him, she has been assessed as eligible for only 22 hours of funding a week. That money comes from the Ministry of Health Disability Support Services. She's financially better off on a benefit. Paying family members to care for their loved ones is by far the cheapest option for the government when it comes to offering support. But it's by no means the only option. There are others, like residential care.
Pictures are, as I'll show you later on, this is all our flatmates that live here. As you can see, there's my photos.
That's Raphael Kibblewhite, who lives at Holt House on Auckland's North Shore. Raphael and his 4 flatmates are looking forward to an upcoming ball for residents of houses run by disabled care organisation Spectrum Care. They live with their cat Kitu and round-the-clock support workers. And the Spectrum ball this weekend, that looks exciting.
Yeah, everyone's going?
The 5 residents are a tight-knit group who like to watch movies and go on outings together. Raphael works part-time at Wendy's, the fast food restaurant, and as the most recent arrival in the flat, he has the smallest bedroom at the back of the house, but says this is much better than his last.
You get up in the morning, smiling faces, you go out and do heaps of stuff. Over at the other house, we just sit around doing nothing. With me, that didn't really work for me because I'm a guy who likes to get out and play sports and be active, and the neighbours are good. We have a lot of visitors coming through.
Ginny Gislason is the house leader at Holt and responsible for managing the residents and carers. She loves the team of people she works with, and they do their best to give the flatmates as many opportunities as possible.
It's about people making choices, their own choices, and about having fun. Ashley in the wheelchair that you met, he did a tandem skydive last year. So it's limited by only what staff feel put the limits on it. The guys make their own choices what they want to do, where they want to go and how they want to do it.
Holt House is owned and run by Spectrum Care, which has about 440 people with both physical and intellectual disabilities in 120 houses across the North Island. It's set up a group called the A-Team, 10 people with disabilities who are trained to advocate for others who live in residential homes and advise Spectrum about residents' concerns. One resident says he shifted into a residential home for independence.
I like to move out of my house. It's not because I don't like my parents. It's because I'm all grown up now. So I need to move out, need to experience new things.
Spectrum says most people want to live in their own place with staff nearby to support them. Another option is supported living, which Dunedin man Jeffrey Heckinson took up 8 years ago.
He's usually got a puzzle on the go as well.
Yeah, usually, yeah.
Yes, we heard that Jeffrey loves his camera, loves his phone.
Jeffrey, who has Down syndrome, shares his flat with Joe, who also has Downs, and a fluffy cat called Tiffany. He gets a benefit of $400 a week and is under the care of the Community Care Trust. Jeffrey's mother, Heather, admits it took a long time before she would agree to let her son go flatting, but he loves it.
You know, I made the decision that it would be really good for Jeffrey to go flatting.
Yeah. What did you think would be good about it?
To learn skills, also just to get that little bit of confidence and which he's got, just branch out and be an adult sort of thing.
Oh, you've done your washing?
Yeah, good one.
Other families choose more independent living. But even when families make that choice, that doesn't spell the end of their problems. Becky Moss has severe epilepsy which causes daily seizures. It's not unusual for her to sprain an ankle or even break a leg because of a seizure. She is also intellectually impaired and doesn't speak. Becky lives in a state house in Auckland and has 2 support workers with her at all times, except for 2 nights a week when her mum stays. She's on a benefit, which means she's more independent and financially better off than if she were in residential care. But housing Becky and providing skilled support for her has been fraught with difficulties. Her mother Jan says they've tried every provider in Auckland and twice tried to manage Becky's caregivers themselves, but have always struck the same problem, finding good and reliable staff. Most move on after realising they can find an easier, less stressful job for the same pay. Becky's sister, Heidi Nilsson, who has herself been a care worker, says a lot of people make the mistake of thinking that because Becky has an intellectual disability, the carers don't need to be smart. But that underestimates her sister's abilities and the need to be one step ahead.
Residential care, then when I've worked in that field or when I've visited people, I just get a sense like if you don't see a person as having value in and of themselves, then, you know, it doesn't matter what you're providing. You won't go to the ends of the earth, you won't think outside the square, you won't try to provide something that's unique and that meets someone's needs. You'll just kind of hum along with the status quo, and that's not what people need.
Garth Benny heads the Disability Support Network, which represents the organisations that provide care. He says families often face difficult choices when looking for alternatives to keeping someone at home. With group homes, there can be issues around a person's choice and control over daily life. And he says supported living can also come with problems.
Finding appropriate accommodation is really, really difficult. Finding appropriate, accessible and affordable accommodation that enables good access to public transport, community facilities and what have you is really challenging.
But there is a wider problem too, the lack of representation and advocacy. Parents like Christine and Jan say children like theirs who have high and very high needs, often with intellectual impairment, are ignored by the government and the very disability groups that are supposed to represent them. Christine says when Justin was born, she believed everyone in the system would do their best for him. But her frustration bubbles over as she explains how that belief has been shattered.
They're not listening. It's like, so why waste my energy? And virtually everything Just does now is private. And it's been set up by parents, the activities. I basically do nothing that is government organised or recommended or sorted or dealt with. It's all private. The dance is private, the swimming is private. Everything that we do has been set up either by me or by other parents.
Why do you do private?
Because there's no other option. There's nothing else. There's nothing else for him.
She devoted 20 years of her life trying to educate, inform and lobby for change. But families say when a new disability strategy was created in 2001, it sidelined them and their disabled children. Jan Moss agrees those with high and very high needs are not adequately represented by the 7 DPOs. That stands for Disabled People's Organisations. She says they won't let parents speak.
I think they fought really hard to get what they got, to be consulted. They're on the Convention Coalition, reporting back to the UN, and that's the thing. They send disabled people out to interview other disabled people to find out how life is for them, so they can report back. So how are you going to go and talk to, the likes of Becky?
Non-verbal.
Yep.
And what did they say?
Well, we need to talk to you about that sometime.
The Disabled Persons Assembly is one of the DPOs, and its president, Jerry Pomeroy, rejects those views. She says that's not the organisation's culture.
I'm very sorry that they have that impression, but that is not our organisational culture, and it is not how we work. We are inclusive, we're generous with opportunities for people to contribute, and we're as transparent as we can be, which is pretty out there and quite transparent.
Jerry Pomeroy denies there is a hierarchy within the disability sector, but others disagree, including the Carers Alliance, a coalition of 46 national not-for-profits striving for better support for family carers. Here's their co-chair, Janine Stewart.
Those who do have a voice and can speak for themselves, and they've become very strong in the last few years, setting the approach, the philosophy, the way in which government is responding. And then families who may be the voice for that more complex group just don't seem to have had a voice in where things have headed.
Controversially, this has included the idea that only those who have a lived experience of disability can talk about it. That excludes family members who care for those who can't speak for themselves. The Carers Alliance says there's been very little work focused on this group of disabled people. The Voices Project looked at this earlier this year. It was a collaboration between the Federation of Disability Information Centres and the Complex Care Group. One parent told the project the disabled people's organisations are a problem.
DPOs have got too big a say.
They have a right to talk on their behalf. Generally, they have physical disabilities, intellectually perfectly able. They even have university degrees. They think they can speak for people with intellectual disabilities. Some of them have made a good living out of government funding to speak for the disabled, but they don't speak for the whole group.
The project's author, Lisa Martin, says DPOs have to be significantly governed by disabled people, which automatically excludes those who have a significant intellectual disability or complex communication issues.
There literally is no DPO representing those with significant intellectual impairments, and it's because of that sort of rather tight criteria that unless they can sort of speak for themselves, then they cannot govern their own organisation and hence can't be called a DPO.
I asked Jerry if a family member can have a lived experience of disability. She insists their experience is not the same as that of the disabled person.
I guess as a parent, you're balancing all when you have a young child with complex disability, you've got the grief of coping with a child who has a different life than what you had hoped for when you were carrying that child. So there's that to deal with, plus there's the complexities of ensuring that your child will receive the supports and services they need so that not only your child can thrive, but you can thrive as a family.
But try telling Christine Fleming she can't speak for her son because she doesn't have a lived experience of disability.
What do you mean I don't live disability? I do nothing without... Is it okay with Justin? How is he going to fit in with that? How's he going to react to that? Every single bit of my life is controlled by disability. I mean, I don't live it. Like, how can you say that? It's just beyond me.
Jan Moss agrees. She says after 36 years of caring for her daughter, she is more than qualified to speak for her. But she says until there's an acceptance that some disabled people can't speak for themselves, little will change. She says the Office for Disability Issues, or ODI, and Disability Support Services, or DSS, within the Ministry of Health, need to revisit their approach.
If they're going to collaborate with people in wheelchairs who are blind and deaf about what Becky's needs are and her friends, then we're never going to get anything. That's my reasoning behind why we haven't got anything. Because ODI and the DSS and things, because it's PC to consult with disabled people only, that's what they do. And so that's why we just continue to have this same old, and whilst they pay lip service to it at meetings like we've just had.
Laurie Hilsgren is the Secretariat of the Carers Alliance. She says people shouldn't underestimate the role played by family carers, who have given up jobs and opportunities to care for someone.
Family carers are a big population of New Zealanders, almost 500,000 counted in the latest census. But because it's work that's easy to take for granted. It's something families have always done. It's something that always seems to just get shunted to the back to deal with later. And the years are going by with, a much more complex society, more cost and responsibility, shifting out into the community, onto families. And we are not keeping up with that as a country. And it's a bit frustrating for carers, certainly the hero families who've taken all the human rights cases. It has just taken so long. It's quite mystifying why, as a country, we do not get that we have to look after the carers too, or they ain't going to be there.
She and Janine Stewart, the Alliance's co-chair, say one of the problems is that the Ministry of Health can't define exactly what qualifies as high and very high needs. If they could do that, that would help ensure consistency. The Ministry of Health says it's awaiting the outcome of a pilot project, Manawa Kaha, which offers disabled people more choice and control over their lives and will take into account the views of family members. It says the pilot is looking at broadening the options for disabled people, including those with high and very high needs. It's doing this by widening the range of people involved in a disabled person's life, so that parents and family are relied on less. It's also introduced what it calls supported decision-making and the creation of meaningful roles for people. Finally, it says it's implementing a personal budget approach that matches resources to the disabled person's plan. Independent disability advocate Jane Carrigan says she has no doubt the pilot will help people who still have the capacity to direct their own lives. But she says it won't cater for those who have high and very high needs, who lack intellectual capacity.
Choice and control is not something, that families have, much less their high and very high needs children have. They both rely heavily on support, and increasingly over the years, and in no small thanks to Enabling Good Lives mantra, these same families have had the sorts of supports they once have been greatly eroded in the promotion of the choice and control concept promoted by Enabling Good Lives.
Meanwhile, families like those of Jan and Christine's battle on.
I do have to watch what he listens to because music affects his mood.
At Christine's house, an Adele DVD is playing on the television. Christine regrets the hours she has spent trying to change the system, saying it's been pointless.
I should have sat on a trend reader book because when I look back now, everything that I have done has just been a complete and utter waste of my energy and my time because I haven't changed a thing. So instead of exhausting myself, instead of spending hundreds of hours over the years battling a system where they're threatening to close down the special education units all the time, which they still are. They're still doing special education reviews. It's still, nothing has changed. In fact, it's got worse since the strategy came out. So I did all of that for nothing.
And she has this simple message for the government: sort out that kitchen drawer.
And that documentary was written and presented by Catherine Hutton. It was made with funding from the 2019 Voyager Media Awards NIB Senior Health Journalism Scholarship. And it will be online if you would like to watch it back. Thanks for joining us. Have a fantastic weekend.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. The Director-General of Health says it was too risky to allow the Pakistan cricketers to train while in managed isolation in Christchurch. Police investigating the death of Auckland woman Elizabeth Zhong are appealing for sightings of her black Land Rover. A disability advocate says changes to the funded family care scheme haven't changed to the fundamental problems with the policy. Ports of Auckland has been fined more than $500,000 over the death of a 23-year-old crane driver, Laboom Dyer. Our next news and weather is at 7.
Take the pulse of the day's news every weeknight at 10.
He's actually gaining quite a bit of support.